Welcome, Susan. Thank you so much for joining us on the Beyond Barriers podcast. We are thrilled to have you here. You have also just released an amazing book that I want to make sure we touch on because you have so many tangible, just pearls of wisdom for people to really have a better work environment. And so I'm not going to steal your thunder. I want you to share all about your book. But before we get started, let our audience know, who is Susan? What was your journey and how did you land here? And then share a little bit about the premise behind your book.
Sure. Thank you, Monica. It's really fun to be here. I'm looking forward to our conversation. So who am I? If you looked at my resume, you would see an HR leader who's been in the HR profession her entire life, it feels like, almost 34 years. And I've had the privilege of working in multiple industries inside the US, outside the US, and for 3 Fortune 500 companies. Mm-hmm. And in the last 14 years, I've been the chief HR officer for 2 of those companies. And so, I always laugh because people never know what really is behind the success and the achievements. and I think it's really important to share that what fueled my success was my underlying limiting beliefs about myself that stemmed from some of the things that happened when I was little, and a belief that I had that I wasn't good enough, and that it was my job to prove myself over and over and over and over again.
Yes.
And it's an exhausting way to live a life and a career. And while I'm proud of the achievements, there's no question about that. And I think that there's a different way to have the same achievements with a lot less of the stress that comes along with that sense of always feeling like we've got to prove ourselves. And that's exactly what I wrote the book about, was the fact that I lived 30 years of my career on what I call the unconscious wounded career path. And the opportunity that we all have is the opportunity to actually step onto the conscious healing career path, which is a much more functional way of living a life and a career.
That's fantastic.
Yeah.
And, I want to dive into, what you talked about around, you had these fears and limiting beliefs. And I think the wonderful thing that you've done in the book is you've been able to get the root cause of it, right? Like, yes, you figured out ways to get past, right? You had some techniques that helped you overcome the fears or get past the limiting beliefs. But I think, when I kind of went through your book and was looking at all these things, it was more like understanding the root cause of what was causing these limiting beliefs that really helped you get rid of them. So share a little bit about that. What were some of the techniques you used, but then also what was the ultimate hack that helped you kind of like finally say, okay, no more?
Well, I think, the journey to get to the insight was a painful journey. And it was living my life as a perfectionist and as a people pleaser.
Yes.
And I somehow walked away from my childhood. And this is not about judging or beating up my parents. I think they did the best they could. So this is not about that at all. But I did subconsciously, at a very deep core level of who I am, believe that it was my job to please others, and it was everybody else's job to determine my worth and my value. And as a result of that, I was always in reaction mode to somebody else's mood. I've got many stories of, the unconscious response that I was having. And, I hate to admit this, but for years, the way I handled the feelings of not being good enough was to do everything I could all the time to make everybody feel like they were the most important stakeholder that I was working with.
Right.
Which again has a big impact on work-life balance. But then at night, I would ruminate about what I did or didn't do, what I said or didn't say, and judge all of it, beating myself up. And the way to take the edge off was to use alcohol to try to calm down. And unfortunately, a lot of overachieving perfectionists use negative self-coping behaviors. And so it was this cycle of this sense of never being able to get off this wheel of, proving myself. And I had a pretty intense experience the night my sister died, and this was 30 years ago. And it took a number of years, but I thought it was really important to write down the story of what happened to her the night she died.
Mhm.
She was diagnosed with Hodgkin's disease, fourth stage when she was 16. She died 10 years later. And what ended up happening was I started writing a manuscript. And the essence of that first manuscript was really about using the most difficult, darkest times in our careers and lives to actually be the greatest teachers of leadership. You know, how do we break through our issues? How do we break through the perfectionism and the people pleasing? The manuscript wasn't very well written, to tell you the truth, because I wrote it over a lot of different years.
Right.
But it did start to lead to this insight that these moments, these most challenging moments in my career, when I am the most triggered, when I'm the most raw relative to feeling that those limiting beliefs,
Mhm.
are actually the moments to practice new ways of responding.
Mm.
And, you know, so I was very lucky that I met Martha Finney. Martha Finney was my co-author on the book back in, we actually met professionally a number of years ago. We reconnected shortly after I was on this journey to try to figure out how do you publish a manuscript.
Right.
And I believe it was God that brought us together, because Martha is very good at what she does. And she never says to somebody, send me your manuscript, I want to read it. But for whatever reason, when we reconnected one day, I told her about what I'd done and she said, send it to me. And I remember saying, well, I'll pay you to read it. I really felt badly asking her to read it.
Uh-huh.
And she said, no, I want to read it. And the next morning when she was reading it, or actually right before she read it, she sent me a note and she said, I have put myself in the last 3 months in self-seclusion at an Airbnb in Florida to sort out some of the things from my past. And
Mhm.
I feel like God has brought us together to work on this project. And I remember, every time I say it, I get chills. Well, she read the manuscript and she wrote back to me, I think that day or the next day. And she
Mhm.
said, I want to know how you went from that childhood to that career. And are you open to some new ways of positioning it? And I said,
Mhm.
sure. So I got really lucky. I hit the Martha jackpot.
Uh-huh.
Hired her as my editor, but she created so much value in terms of the insights and the hacks that you were asking about a minute ago that
Mhm.
really led to the book as it stands today, Healing at Work. And so some of those insights that we can teach is just
Mhm.
the awareness that when we get triggered at work, when we have a strong negative emotional reaction, right?
Mhm.
I'm sure every one of us deals with
Oh,
that. There's
yes.
a lot of conflict that happens at work. When that happens, it's an immediate clue that we're likely overreacting to whatever's happening, because
Mhm.
it's fueled by all those underlying negative beliefs we carry about ourselves, and we automatically go into fight, flight, or freeze. It's just this. Our brains are wired to
Right.
respond. You know this. I mean, you and I were talking before we started
Yeah.
video that a lot of us come away from our childhoods with these beliefs. But we can actually use the workplace conflicts, what Martha and I call bumper car moments, when we crash into another person,
I love that.
someone
Yes.
crashes into us. Yeah, actually, we even put the bumper cars on the book.
Mhm.
Two people facing off. It's what it often feels like, is that when there's some intense emotional
Mhm.
reaction, that's immediately a clue that we're having a bumper car moment. And
Right.
when we're in the middle of a bumper car moment, we have a choice. We can either have an unconscious reaction, which is typically an overreaction,
Mhm.
or we can have a conscious reaction, which is that conscious healing career path response. And so there's actually a technique that we don't go into a lot of detail in the book, but
Uh-huh.
the technique is called the rapid power reclaim.
Yes.
It's very easy to lose ourselves in that trigger. You know, when our central nervous system and our brain get hooked and we
Yes.
go into that physiological reaction. Rapid power reclaim is a simple 3-step process. Step number 1 is to create choice. As soon as you feel that emotional physiological response, realize that you've been triggered, you're in a bumper car moment, but you have a choice to respond rather than going immediately into the physiological response. We always go into that fight, flight, or freeze.
Yes.
That is a clue that we have to do some work. So in order to do that, you have to create some choice. And the choice is realizing that you can respond differently than having that old past. It's almost like our childhood past is hitchhiked onto our shoulders with us coming into work.
Right.
And so the second step then is to elevate your action. That rather than having the immediate what I would call the knee-jerk reaction to what we typically do. Go talk to colleagues. I can't believe she did that. Can you believe the boss is showing up this way? Someone interrupted me in a meeting. I didn't get a promotion. All these things cause these reactions. We can elevate our action in the moment, which is rather than responding how we might have when we were younger. For me, it's people pleasing.
Right.
It's, wait a minute, I am an adult. I am operating in my highest functioning self. How do I want to respond to this situation differently? If we stay stuck in the trigger, we lose the choice. Sometimes we go into this adrenaline warp and we actually lose track of where we are.
Yes.
You can just break that moment and step out and create choice and then elevate the action. You can have a very different response. And I'll give you some examples of this in a minute. I feel like I'm talking too much. The third step of the rapid power reclaim is when you do that, when you have a different positive elevated action, you will have a different outcome. And so the third step is about integrating and celebrating. And so the whole premise is based on the science of neuroplasticity, which basically says our brains are plastic and are malleable, and we can change the neural pathways from the old ones, which are the old triggered responses, to creating new pathways based on the science of positive psychology and neuroplasticity. So when we have a positive response to a negative situation, a bumper car moment, we actually are starting to create new neural pathways in our brain. The way that we integrate that into our identity is to take a moment to celebrate the fact that we handled something differently. And so that's the 3-step process to manage a bumper car moment. And maybe
that's fantastic.
I'm going to stop talking for a minute because I'm talking too much.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. I actually, because it's what's resonating with me is that, I think you and I lived parallel lives, because I am a big perfectionist and I'm always trying to, do the people pleasing thing. And I know that I have kind of some probably subconscious reactions when I feel like I have failed or some sort of setback. And then I'll ruminate on that forever. And then, I'll bypass another opportunity, or I'll just kind of sit there forever. So tell me a little bit about that. So in that moment, and sometimes I'll reflect and say, okay, next time. But sometimes when I'm in the moment, I don't pause to figure out, like you said, that step number 1 of I have a choice here. I can either do what I usually do, or I can do something different. So what would the tips what are some tips you would share of in that moment? How do you disrupt that pattern?
Well, I'll give you a couple different examples. So one of them, as soon as you feel that, we need to understand what are our triggers. You mentioned some of your triggers of fear of failure, that underlying fear. For me, a trigger is if I feel like, if something happens and I feel stupid, somebody does something and I interpret it as I'm stupid. Another trigger for me is if I feel like I'm getting in trouble. These, it's important to first of all understand what are your hooks, what triggers you that causes the emotional reaction. So just a simple exercise is to list out, when do you get triggered? Recognize your triggers. And then also to do a little bit of work about what are some of my underlying beliefs about myself. In this work on the book with Martha, we've had a chance to talk to a lot of executives and professionals and asking them about underlying limiting beliefs. And it's amazing how much these limiting beliefs guide our responses to other people at work.
Yes.
And so I remember talking to a very high level leader who worked in a foreign country on behalf of the US. And he was taught by his dad that he could never do anything right. His underlying belief is, I can't do anything right. And he picks a really high level important job in a foreign country where he has to do everything right. Or people's lives could be lost. But that underlying belief drove him and created, a significant amount of stress. It actually makes my heart sad to hear some of the limiting beliefs that people have. But the opportunity is to be aware of, what are your limiting beliefs? What are your triggers? When are you going to get hooked? Be really clear about those moments. And then we're more alert, we're more conscious to recognizing them when they happen. Sometimes it catches us by surprise. We like the bumper car analogy, because when we were little, or teenagers at the amusement park, riding in the bumper car ride with friends and family, sometimes someone would tap you and you'd kind of laugh like, oh, that was funny, but ha ha.
Yeah.
It's slamming into you and completely catches you off guard. So
Yeah.
it's important to be conscious and aware of those situations that are going to cause a reaction.
Mhm.
Years ago, I worked with a leader that his trigger was feeling disrespected. If someone did something that caused him to feel disrespected, he would have a strong anger reaction. That was his way of protecting himself.
Right.
My reaction is people pleasing. Your reaction is perfectionism. We all have our different strategies for managing those triggers, but they also have a detrimental effect on our relationships with people at work.
Mhm.
And they also have a detrimental effect on how we have a relationship with ourselves and also our loved ones outside of work.
Mhm.
So some of the first thought is the consciousness, the awareness. And I have a graphic. I haven't used it in the book, but I'm going to use it in some of the follow-up work. There's
Yeah.
actually an image of, imagine you're growing up, you're having some bumper car moments when you're little,
Uh-huh.
into our careers, and the bumper car moments keep happening professionally, and we start to spiral down. It's an image of spiraling down
Yes.
in this unconscious state. If you can imagine in your head when you get triggered, that you also could be spiraling up by having conscious reactions,
Mhm.
having a graphic in your head, when someone's come crashing into you, to immediately say, oh my gosh, I have a choice. And that's
Yes.
about creating choice. We still have the physiological response. Our bodies are wired to have that. What I
Mhm.
know is important in creating choice is I have to discharge that emotion. And so whatever way a person can discharge the emotion, for some people, it's, screaming as loudly as they can just to get the energy and that emotion, that triggered feeling inside, that physiological. Sometimes it's crying.
Right.
For some people, they like to express it through drawing. I've got a friend named Sheila Darby. She's got a
Yes.
book called Sketch Poetic.
Love Sheila. Know her well.
I love her. And so the expression of the emotion is getting it out of you, purging it out of you, whatever way that looks like. There are lots of different ways to do that. So you've got to discharge that physiological response, or it's hard to elevate action. And so there are lots of different strategies for discharging the energy.
Mm-hmm.
And then, so that really answers your question. How do you handle that physiological response? Is consciously being aware. What we teach in the book is you can use the workplace as a laboratory for healing, like your own little mini lab every day. Oh boy, here comes another bumper car moment. I'm going to use it to practice a new response, rather than my unconscious, oh my God, I'm in trouble. I got to fix it. Who do I need to please? What do I need to do? It's the outdated script that gets launched unconsciously. We can interrupt the pattern and put in a new conscious script.
I think that is fascinating, because as I was reading some of these, I'm like, oh my gosh, I do that too. Like if I feel like you named some of mine, when I feel stupid, or like, and it may not even be someone, it's that inadvertent, even in some cases, right? The unconscious microaggression that and then I have to catch myself and saying, okay, they didn't mean it this way. How can I not unravel, right? And like you said, spiral downwards. How can I stop this moment and take a breath and say, okay, I'm not going to let myself go down that path. But it takes work. And it's because I have identified some of those things. But I'm sure there's more to the list that I can add, that, even, like you said, those bumper car moments of just stopping and saying, okay, why am I getting angry right now? I think it's really important to pause and to do that. Tell me, in your career, I mean, I know that you've, as an HR leader, you're having to deal with lots of different dimensions of diversity.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see some of these characteristics playing out more with women or underrepresented groups? And how have you helped, how did you help identify those and get people to work through them?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it's a topic I'm very passionate about, is creating a culture where everybody feels included. And what I have done, and what I've had the privilege of doing, is working with and partnering with a number of different people, men and women, insider group and outsider groups.
Yes.
And what's interesting is that the reality is that a lot of people, men, women, African American, Black, Hispanic, straight, LGBT are dealing with some of these issues, because the research shows that 2/3 of American adults, and the studies have been validated in other countries as well, 2/3 of us, nearly 2/3, grew up in some form of a dysfunctional home.
Mm-hmm.
And there's actually a whole body of research around something called ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences. The Centers for Disease Control has some great research on their website. There are 10 ACEs, 10 adverse childhood experiences that go from, emotional, physical, sexual abuse, neglect, divorce, death in a family, violence in the home, mental illness. There's a list. 2/3 have experienced at least one of those.
Mm-hmm.
And nearly 13%, including myself and Martha, experience 4 or more. And so the reality is that in the workplace, 2/3 of people are what Martha and I call adult survivors of a damaged past. We had something happen in our past that wasn't a positive thing. And so the question about, doing the work with women and underrepresented or marginalized populations is absolutely, there's a lot of opportunity to do that. I do a lot of one-on-one coaching. I know you do a lot of coaching as well in your organization. So there's an opportunity to help people learn the concepts that we teach in the book. I do that working with a number of different women in the organization and men, and also teaching men the same concepts. Men sometimes have different reactions when they're triggered than women do. But for me, my ultimate life purpose is really all about teaching self-acceptance to create a more joyful world. So that's for everybody. And underlying a lot of the essence and the issues around limiting beliefs is an underlying sense that we aren't as self-accepting as we could be, or that we need to be.
Right.
And when we discover deeper levels of self-acceptance, and that could be harder to do depending on what your background was, and again, that it's hard. Everybody has such unique and different experiences when they're from their past and from their professional lives. All of that affects our limiting beliefs and our triggers. And so I think it does show up differently depending on those pasts and depending on some of the things you're talking about. But the beauty of the concepts of healing at work, you guide to overcoming your past through career conflicts, is basically everybody is influenced, whether you are one of those 2/3 or you're working with someone that's in the 2/3 group. And you wonder why are they having such a strong reaction to this?
Right.
It seems out of proportion. It gives a sense of perspective and context around understanding some of these issues. And I'm sure you're aware of Oprah Winfrey and Dr. Bruce Perry's new book, What Happened to You?
Yes.
Typically, when we see somebody having a bizarre or over strong emotional reaction, our tendency is to say what's wrong with them. And in Oprah's book and Dr. Perry's book, they talk about, I wonder what happened to them. So it goes right back to those paths that we come from. And, a lot of us had issues with authority when we were little. Our parents, one or the other, or both. We get into the workplace and there's authority all over the place. It's a setting right for opportunity for discovering new ways of responding versus some of the ways that we did in the past.
That's fantastic. And something that struck a point of curiosity for me was, we tend to, when I was reading yours, and it was just like, okay, dealing with a traumatic or dysfunctional kind of home or past, and you immediately are like, well, I don't think I had that. However, when I started reading more in your book and you were describing or unpacking kind of the whole dysfunction, is that you were saying you dealt with, an angry parent or an angry father. And then I realized, what, if I really think about sometimes how, I learned a lot from, just, it's even like an angry grandparent, right? I had a grandfather, my mother's father, who was just, very strict, very stern. And so my mom was a very much people pleasing kind of perfectionist person. And then I was in the same way. And so you kind of see some of that of how that played out in, in your life, and how that now plays out in the workplace. Can you share a little bit more of like what we mean by dysfunction, because I think people sometimes have a very negative association with the word dysfunction and are saying, oh,
Sure.
no, that's not me. And in the reality of
Yeah.
things, when you start digging in, you're like, wait a minute, that is me. I'm part of that 2/3.
Yeah, no, you just gave me chills when you talked about your grandfather and the dynamic with your mom, because a lot of these are generational. You know, we learn what our parents taught us.
Yes.
They also typically came from, childhoods that were challenging. So yeah, it's a great question. So dysfunctional, I mean that in the broadest sense of the word. I use the ACEs, that's a subset of, coming from a childhood that was maybe challenging. The reality is a lot of people say that to me. Well, I didn't have a dysfunctional past. I didn't experience any of the ACEs. And I say, no, that's great. Is it possible that you had an overly critical parent? Perhaps a parent like me, and this breaks my heart when I talk about it. I was so busy focused on trying to prove myself at work and worrying about it when I was at home, and then, drinking and not being fully present. My kids experienced some of that, not being around, not being present, because I was so focused at work. Did I love my sons? Of course I love them. But when I look back at it, they're now grown and we've had a lot of really meaningful conversations. They absolutely felt my lack of presence. So that had an impact on them. And I'm sure they have limiting beliefs that come from it. But what I often find is people may not necessarily connect with the term either dysfunctional or damaged past. That's fine. If you have any limiting beliefs that are getting in your way, then the book is for you. And the opportunity is to understand how whatever is going on for you, it could have been something that happened to you when you were an adult. That if you're interested in finding new ways to have a different experience in the workplace, a much more grounded, in the moment, present reaction to what's going on around us, it's a very broadly, the concepts work broadly. I also often find that people, and this was a big struggle for me, don't ever want to actually share with others that anything negative happened because they want to protect their families, their reputation. I almost didn't write the book because I was concerned about how this would be viewed about my dad. My dad passed away a long time ago, but he was known in the community where I grew up. Sometimes we've taught so much to keep the secrets of the family, you don't share that. Other people say, my past was challenging, but it fueled my success. And I say, great. I feel the same way. My question is, could it have been fueled and have the same success with a lot less of the stress and heaviness that you carry throughout your life? Typically, the answer is yes. And so it's fascinating because you're right. A lot of people say, well, I don't really relate to the terms, or, I didn't have any of those ACEs. But when you start talking about some of the who's this book for, do you beat yourself up because you feel like what you did could have been better? Do you have a hard time with work-life balance because you don't like to say no to people?
Right.
These things affect us.
They do, and it wasn't really honestly till, I've had a very extremely loving, supportive family. I'm the oldest and only daughter and the oldest granddaughter in the family. But, it wasn't until my wife pointed out that she was like, your perfectionism also comes from, they hold me up on this pedestal and I can do no wrong. And then it's like this bar that I'm constantly trying to, live up to and seek validation from that, and had to really disassociate myself from that to say, okay, who am I doing this for? I need to self-validate, kind of like you were saying. So it resonated so much.
Yeah, no, I love that. I mean, that's a great example of, even in a really positive environment, the expectations you felt about yourself put a lot of pressure on yourself that you probably unconsciously carried along. You've been wildly successful in your corporate, now your consulting business. And but it does take a toll, and both in terms of health, in terms of quality of life, in terms of quality of relationships, and all that we can turn that all around because we have a choice. That's the beauty of the conscious career path. We have a choice.
Yes, I love that. Now, I know you have this amazing, there's this downloadable that I found on your website about like the 34, correct me if I'm wrong, it was like the 34 ways to make yourself feel better instantly.
Yep.
And I found it very, just very tangible of, different things of like reminding yourself about the things you've accomplished in your career, or which, we teach a lot of the women that we coach around like creating this greatest hits list. What are your accomplishments? Go back and remind yourself of them and things like that. And celebrating progress, not just the achievement. What are some others that you would want to leave our listeners with in terms of, making sure that, the next time they feel crappy at work or have a bumper car moment, what are some, pearls of wisdom you want to leave behind for them to kind of remember and maybe put into action?
Thank you. I love it. And so one of the another pearl of wisdom I would describe is that when we're in that unconscious place, our inner critic is driving the bus.
Yes.
And we can make a choice from inner critic to inner coach. We have that available to us immediately. We get to choose how we respond. That's another technique. Do I want the inner critic to be in charge today, or am I going to let my inner coach be in charge? And that's actually a practice of self-care, self-acceptance, is using those moments and coming from an inner voice coach rather than the inner critic, which my experience carries around a baseball bat hitting us on the head all the time.
Right.
So that's one pearl of wisdom. The other one I would leave you with, and I don't think it's on the list, but the 34 ways are really good, is just this concept of the workplace as a laboratory for healing. I think if we shift our mindset from the workplace as a place of a lot of stress and exhaustion and worry to this is an opportunity to reprogram my brain, that I can become aware of the triggers and the responses. My response, adrenaline response is freeze. Other people will flight, other people will fight. And so getting really clear about what's my physiological response and what do I want to do differently about it going forward. There's so much opportunity to actually start looking forward to the bumper car moments. I kind of look forward, I'm like, when I get triggered now, I say, oh, here's an opportunity for growth. And by the way, I'm very fortunate to now be sober for over 17 years. And so no longer using, these negative self-soothing techniques to manage the bumper car moments, but actually practicing self-care and self-coaching by looking for the opportunities to continue to learn and grow. And oh my gosh, we could spend so much more time talking about some of the other hacks, but thank you for asking about it.
No, that's fantastic, Susan. And I know that our listeners are going to be, just anxious to get their hands on some more of these. So what is the best way for, someone to learn a little bit more? Where can they get your book? How can they actually download the 34 ways? What's the best way for them to to keep in touch with you?
Best way is, and it's the same way to get the 34 ways document as well, is if you go to my personal website, it's Susan J. Schmidt, SCHMITT.com, SusanJSchmidt.com. At the very top of the landing page is the 34 ways to make yourself feel better. So you can click on that, give me your email. I'll send you the beautiful document that we had designed. And then also on the website, I've got a whole page about the book. You can get information about where you can obviously go to Amazon. I've confused people by getting remarried. Susan Schmidt, and I'm now Susan Schmidt Winchester.
Well, congratulations. Yeah.
Thank you. I know, pre-COVID, it was right before COVID. So if you go to Amazon, you can certainly type in Susan Schmidt or Susan Winchester in books, and it comes right up. I think the giveaway is the bumper car, the bumper cars, just to help people remember. But that's the easiest way to find out about what's going on in the book. I'm obviously on LinkedIn as well, Susan Schmidt Winchester on LinkedIn.
Fantastic. Well, I know that's, getting people to rethink the workplace of being kind of, like you said, a laboratory for growth is an absolutely wonderful way to kind of shift your mindset. And being someone who was a science nerd and loved being in the lab, in college, it's a great way to say, okay, I can experiment now and
Yeah.
help, help me get over some of these, moments, these trigger moments that I can get rid of in the moment. So thank you so much for that. It'll be something that I will constantly now, like you say, okay, this is an experimental moment that I get to experiment with and see some growth. So thank you so much for helping me learn to spiral upwards.
Thank you, Monica. I loved the conversation, really appreciate it. And I'm definitely looking forward to talking with you more about the great things you're doing at Beyond Barriers, some really amazing work to help companies.
Thank you.